Greetings, citizens of planet Earth. Welcome back to another episode of the Mystery Dome. Today we will be talking about time travel. This episode is a continuation of the previous week's episode about time travel. Since time travel is such a broad topic, we needed two parts, so this is part 2. Now, what I failed to talk about in the last one was how time travel naturally happens anyway. And there is this concept called time dilation, which you may have heard of, that causes time to travel differently for different people at different locations based on their speed and their structure. It all accounts to the flow of time, as well as gravity that does that. And this means I failed to mention the fact that causing those measures of natural time travel to go to the extremes could actually be a viable way of creating a system where you could travel through time. Now, I also kind of trailed off when I was talking about people that claim to be time travelers. And I do believe that time travel is theoretically possible, but these people are all on kind of the same board. Sometimes they claim different things, but they all kind of have this general theme about them. It's not very credible, so I don't believe the people that have claimed to be time travelers in the past are time travelers, but I definitely think that it's possible. There's another story that I wanted to address that actually has a really interesting idea about time travel, and that's wiki history. And wiki history is a very short story, about a page, that talks about where time travel is real by the early 22nd century, and some guy online uses it to go back in time to kill Hitler before the beginning of World War II. And another time traveler is forced to stop him before he can change history. And the guy who stopped him is like, oh yeah, everybody kills Hitler their first time. And that was really interesting to me because it made me realize that time travelers from the future could be coming back and changing things, and then other time travelers from the future are coming back to stop that quickly enough that it doesn't matter. And I just find that concept of, everybody doing the same thing just so interesting, especially when it comes to time travel. Some shows or movies also predict that time travel can happen between universes, where some universes are further along in time than others. For example, Into the Spider-Verse talked about how one of the versions of Spider-Man was from the 31st century, and another version was from the 20th century, and pretty much all the other versions were from the 21st century. It was all very interesting stuff, and it kind of is interesting because maybe the theory that all of the different quantum realities started from a single Big Bang, maybe some universes aren't that way. Maybe some universes are further along than others. And I thought that concept of that time what's the word I'm looking for? Inconsistency. That time inconsistency across universes. I thought that was kind of interesting. And I thought we might be able to apply it to the real world. For example, we know information about the Star Trek universe into the 29th century, so you could theoretically argue that in Star Trek time, we're around the year 3000, even though we're not in our reality. That maybe that's the reality for them, and those are the equivalent times. So I thought that concept was fairly interesting. And I would also like to point out the fact that not all time travel has to be completely linear. Some time travel is kind of, it's hard to explain, but if you've ever time traveled in dreams before, you might know what I'm talking about, where you end up in different times every few seconds in completely different timelines. It's a little hard to describe in words. It's just, it's kind of a weird mix of everything, and this probably isn't the case in reality, but it might be for time travel. But another thing I wanted to talk about, and something I've been avoiding ever since the beginning of the first video, is Doctor Who, which pretty much is the sci-fi show that does the most time travel of any show. And so they claim to have different systems for traveling into the future and the past, which is fairly realistic considering the fact that they might take up different levels of energy. For example, I would make the argument that, well, first of all, I need to clarify that surrounding the TARDIS when they time travel is a colored, like, tube, or like the spatial, or the entire universe maybe just compressed into a tube when they're time traveling, and sometimes it's blue and sometimes it's red. And I would make the argument that it's red when they're traveling to the future. How should I know this? Well, because the natural flow of time is forwards. Going to the future is simply accelerating that natural flow of time. And that takes less energy than reversing the flow of time altogether and accelerating it backwards. It takes a lot less energy to just accelerate it forwards. And lower energies create lower and longer wavelengths. And on the long side of the spectrum, of the color spectrum, when it comes to wavelengths, is red. And red is produced from low energy. And that's why I would argue that going to the future creates red. And going to the past creates blue, because going to the past, we're stopping time entirely and going backwards and accelerating backwards. That takes a lot of energy. And now we move up the scale to high energy wavelengths, dense wavelengths, short wavelengths, and you have bluish colors. So that's why I would argue that. And Doctor Who is just really interesting because it's not all about what time you're from, because time isn't a concept to some beings like the Time Lords, which the Doctor is. Time doesn't exist for them. They're simply guardians of the universe that go to different times to, see different events. The same thing with the wormhole aliens or the prophets from Star Trek Deep Space Nine, where they just experience events all over the place. They don't see time like we do. They just appear. And I feel like that's really fascinating, because years could pass for us, but that could be seconds for them. Or maybe this year, 2020, could be further in the past for them than 1990 is. And it could, that's really an interesting way of thinking about things. Anyways, I'm running out of time, so I would like to make one final point. The fact that time travel may be used maliciously if it falls into the wrong hands. And this Star Trek explores this a little bit with temporal prime directive and that kind of thing, where it makes sure that capabilities to stably time travel don't fall into the hands of people that would try to alter the timeline for themselves or to try and just sabotage everything. And I feel like that's a real risk if we actually come up with time travel, as some people will try to use it to their own advantage or just to sabotage everything. And I think we need to be careful of that. And that's the one thing I am concerned about when we're talking about time travel, is the fact that people might do it on purpose just to be bad. So that wraps up our discussion about time travel. So that should be it. I will see you next week on another episode of the Mystery Dome. Stay tuned.